Good morning. So this is my first of two sessions about four-letter acronyms in FileMaker, JSON. And early schedules showed my other session at the exact same time, but time travel is a bit wibbly-wobbly, so my other session is tomorrow on Perform Script and Server, not right now. I thought about doing them in parallel, but that didn't quite work out. Anyway, so this is leveraging JSON in your custom apps, which is a fancy way of saying just FileMaker. And my name's Anders Monsen. So obligatory slide here. So who am I? I'm a developer and trainer at Soliant Consulting, a tiny consulting company, but it's bigger than that. Along the way, I've been using FileMaker for about 23 years or so, and along the way I picked up a few certifications. I've spoken at FileMaker DevCon a few times. So this is my 10th DevCon and 10th time speaking. It's exciting stuff sometimes. I've done some training. Also, I've written a few FileMaker articles over the years, most recently 2 months ago on FileMaker 16's new JSON functions. So parsing and creating JSON. So some of that stuff we'll see towards the end here when we're talking about 16 stuff. Outside FileMaker, I do a little bit of things just for balance, and that includes a little bit of running. So I like to call myself a reformed marathoner, and I don't do marathons anymore, but I still like to run. I'm also a second Dan in Taekwondo. Over the years, picked up a few belts along the way, and I'm trying to write crime fiction. Crime fiction to me is a lot like FileMaker development, solving mysteries along the way. And sometimes you want to kill certain things, so, but, you know. So why are we here? Well, the title is JSON, right? So we want to learn about JSON. And why do we want to learn about JSON? Well, the big thing right now is integrating with web services. We saw a little bit about that in the session last night, but more and more web services out there are using JSON as a way to send data. You can also now, with 16 curl functions, you can push JSON out. It's becoming an interesting part of FileMaker, and an important part, I think, learning JSON. There's two things to consider, pre-16 and post-16. Pre-16, there's sort of a watershed moment with 16, because pre-16, you had to do it, basically on your own stuff with custom functions or some plugins or a combination of both, and we'll see some of how that works. And then, of course, with 16, 2 months ago, 16 came out, so it's pretty new. So you may not all be using 16 yet, so we're going to do a little bit of both 16 and pre-16 stuff. Right. So in terms of JSON, it's fairly young. Right. So a little bit behind here. So there's a joke in here. I didn't quite build this slide, but I'm going to leave it because if you catch the joke, you can laugh. But it's only been around for a few years, and a few years in technology is like a lifetime. But that means that standards in JSON aren't always followed between one web service to another, one JSON builder to another. So there are things that we have to deal with in terms of those standards. Not everyone's going to write the same type of JSON. That means how they format it, how they name certain pieces of it. And you'll see that some people like to name things very differently. Some people like to structure things differently. So we have to learn how to deal with that type of formatting. If the JSON is malformed, and it's not always malformed, although it looks that way, then we have to process it in ways that functions that we run into with FileMaker native functions or other functions that have been written aren't necessarily going to work for us. So we may have to create our own functions. We have to sort of build into our parsing some custom functions that we want to use, right? So that's going to be part of what we're going to cover today. There's 5 things that we're going to focus on, or 5.5, really. Because what is JSON? Because so far I've just been using the acronym JSON. And why do we want to use it? And I've already alluded to that with the web services. Second thing is, how do we get JSON into our FileMaker apps? How do we get JSON into FileMaker? And then how do we take that JSON and do with it what we want to do, right? So then understanding that not all JSON is created equally, and there are reasons for that in some cases. And we'll talk about why those reasons are there. Then we're going to parse JSON using custom functions. So in Fix 16, there's other ways to do it, but I'm going to focus on the custom function part here because some of the stuff that we'll see as other ways really has been adapted into 16 functions, and they're very similar. And then some cool stuff that we can do in 16. And the cool stuff is mainly the parsing stuff, but also some creating if we get that time to create the JSON stuff. All right. So now let's define our JSON. And JSON really stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And for us as FileMaker people, that really is almost irrelevant. Right? So it's not necessarily JavaScript, because not all JSON is JavaScript. Not all JavaScript is JSON. And the object notation part, it really is because there are functions in JavaScript that can convert JSON into the objects and vice versa. But JSON really is text. So if you have any takeaways from here, it's that it's human-readable text. It's comprised of attribute and value pairs, or key and value pairs. I tend to use the key value. But you can use attribute, you can use, say, identifier or name or label. Those are all valid, I guess, identifying one part of the pair. So it's a key and a value pair. And there's a couple of reasons I use the key, because one, it's shorter, and two, it's important, or it comes up in the parameters in our 16 functions. It's language independent, which means that if I have JavaScript, Python, PHP, Objective-C, those languages, FileMaker, I can talk back and forth between those. Those can interpret JSON. Some of them have functions to build it, and some functions to parse it. So it's nice to communicate between FileMaker and other apps. History of JSON, and I'm going to speed through a couple of these here to get to more interesting stuff later on. But it was originally created in the early 2000s. And you see a lot of similar technology like JSON. There's XML, there's YAML, there's other types of formatting data that you can send between systems. But JSON is one of those that was created back in the early 2000s. And then there's some modern standards that have been really implemented only, 4 years ago now. So anything pre that will tend to have a little bit of different formatting. JSON is really lightweight. So I've used XML a lot, and a lot of web services will use XML, but more and more are using JSON as well because it's lightweight, it's faster. Because it's lightweight, it's developed for JavaScript between client and server. The goal is to get that data to you fairly fast. It is human readable, so once you can understand, you can see it at a glance and see exactly where things are, at least when it's formatted in a certain way. And the syntax is pretty easy and simple to use and remember once you've grasped it. I was pretty used to XML for a long time and resisted JSON, but once it clicked, it clicked. All right. So there's two kinds of JSON, or JSON formats. Right? There's simple and complex, and there are degrees along the way, but basic JSON is fairly straightforward. Right? So this is the format right here, where you have a little bit of text in here, and it's pretty, right now we've just made these generic, label 1, value 1, and so on. Usually, this is what's called a JSON object. So a JSON object will begin with curly brackets. So object, curly brackets, first thing to remember. Right? So you then have the key, or which we have put as label in double quotes here on the left-hand side. The key just identifies what's going to be, what you're going to use to extract the value out. So if we want to get value 1, I'm going to use label 1 as the key. Separated by a colon, so one of very few characters that you need to remember, colon there, and it has the value. Right? So in this case, we have the value inside double quotes, and there's a reason for that. We'll get into that when we talk about data types. Then we have all these key value pairs are then separated by commas. So curly bracket at the top, object, key on the left, colon as a separator, value, and then we have our record or row separator here as the comma. And then closing it with curly brackets. So every opening bracket needs a matching paired bracket there. Right? So that's fairly basic JSON that's easy to read, that's easy to construct when we want to construct it, but it gets more complex along the way. One last thing to remember is that white space is ignored. So for formatting purposes, we can see it like this, but it could all be one line, and it would work from one system to the other system. All right. Now we're getting beyond the basic stuff, and even though this is called a simple array, arrays can get pretty complex. And array is marked by a square bracket. So just as we have a curly bracket denoting that it's an object, anytime you see a square bracket, it's an array. You might, in terms of FileMaker analogies, consider an array as a portal or a repeating field, but it's much more than that because arrays can be multidimensional. So you can build more things into arrays than you could inside, say, a repeating field or inside a portal. But I like to think of them in terms of FileMaker stuff when I'm looking at it as portals, and we'll see the potential for that when we're creating and parsing some JSON. Right? So in here, arrays will have multiple values. This is a simple array because I just have 3 values in here. So another way to think of it as an array is just a collection of values. So you have one value as the value 2 and value 3, and the array here is multiple values. It still is linked to a key, in this case, label 1. Yes? You don't need that. So that's in there just and some parsers will actually say that is invalid, but in some it'll work, right? So that's a good question, but so in this case, that value there it doesn't need to be there. The key thing that is the value between the pairs, right? So and inside the array, you have the comma separators just as you have the comma separators between the records. One thing to consider when you have arrays is that arrays are index-based. So if I want to extract the first value out of the array or the second value, I have to indicate it by using an index. And in JSON, those indexes are 0-based. So if I want to get the first value, I have to use 0 as my index. Second value is 1. So it's a little counterintuitive. If you're going through iterate through those values, you have to start at 0. All right, so just as you can have arrays inside objects, you can have objects inside objects. So you can actually bury objects fairly deep. So you can have objects and arrays inside fairly creatively. In this case here, we have, excuse me, we have a key, DevCon location, inside an object. So the object, again, starts with a curly bracket. So just as you have a curly bracket at the top, curly bracket at the bottom, denoting it's an object, you have another object inside this object, but it's inside the value. So you don't have objects and keys. Any arrays, any objects, and so on are inside the values. So DevCon location is my key, telling me that for this name or identifier, I have an object, and this object has 3 sets of values. So if you remember the first object, each value in there is separated by a colon. So 2017 is the key, and the colon indicates the separator between the key and the value, and Phoenix is the value there. Right? So inside, again, that object separated by a comma, another pair of key and values, and then the third one the same way. So we have objects inside objects. So it can get fairly deep. But again, this is pretty readable. If you did this in XML, there would be more stuff around it. So it's also, it's lightweight and readable. Those are the key things to have there. Right. So if I want to format this to be more readable, again, white space is ignored. So now all I have to do is just put some returns and some white space in there, and I can see that I have my object inside the DevCon location, and I've got the different keys and values in there. Right. So moving along the progression between basic and simple, we get to some nested object arrays. Right? So I've got an object in here that has a speakers as the key, and I have an object inside that value, and I have sessions in there as another key. So I've got name is the key, Anders Monsen, me is the value, sessions. The sessions is an array with 2 values in there. And then I have another name here, and Sarah, sorry, I left it in there. So that way you can build, you can keep building on data inside your JSON, nesting objects, nesting arrays. You can have additional arrays and objects nested inside each other. It can get pretty complicated in terms of when you actually when to parse that or when to build that. Right. So again, object, curly bracket, right? Key value. Here's our nested object with sessions as the key, and then the square brackets are our array in here. So again, anytime you see square brackets, you're going to be dealing with arrays. All right. So far, we've talked about objects and arrays without saying what they are. We've also seen an example of another data type, but just like in FileMaker where you have data types, so you have text, you have number, container, and so on, you have data types in JSON. And there's some valid data types. First one is string, which is the most common one. It's the most basic that you have. It's inside double quotes. Anytime you see inside double quotes, it's a value. That's a string. And number, without double quotes, you can have, say, age or a quantity. If the number is inside double quotes, it's treated as a string. Then you have arrays. You have the JSON object. So object can be a data type. Boolean is another data type, so true or false. So you can have a key, and then you have the word true or false outside or without double quotes, and that's considered a data type. And then you have null or empty. So those are valid data types. For the most part, you'll see a lot of strings, but you can run into the other ones as well. Arrays or objects, arrays and objects, numbers, those are common. Some will send booleans and nulls. There's a few invalid ones. So FileMaker functions won't work as data types if you're building something. Other functions either. Then if it's a date, it's usually it has to be inside double quotes. You can't just have a date format. And then also because I guess regional differences in dates, you won't have the date format as considered a valid data type. When you're creating JSON, you have to define your data types. So if it's undefined, it's considered really an invalid type there. Right. So we're getting to the meat of the matter here. How do we get JSON into our custom apps? You could write your own from scratch. You could have it in a text document and bring it into FileMaker that way. Or more typically, you can import it from a web service. So that's what we're going to do is look at how that's done, getting it in from the web service. There's a ton of APIs out there. There's a good website called Programmable Web that has a list, a lot of APIs out there. Also, if you go there and you look at them, you can search for different types of APIs. You can see, do they return XML? Do they return JSON? Do they return some other format? Most of those options, if they return both, you get to specify which one. Some will do one, some will do the other only. But a lot of them, at least early on, would specify the different, if you wanted JSON, you'd say JSON. You wanted XML, you'd say XML. And how do we use that? Well, there's a script step in FileMaker called import from URL. So that's been around for a few years. When I first started using this 5 or so years ago, I relied on XML as the format. But because there were really there were no built-in functions to parse it, and there's some good custom functions that really took out the XML that I needed. So, but now with JSON, and especially with FileMaker 16, we can do a lot of neat things. Right. There's 2 parameters in here. The first one is the field that the JSON will be imported into. Although if you're using FileMaker 16, you can now use a variable, so you don't have to use the field. But previously, you had to use the field, and the field had to be on the layout. So you insert it into the field. The field would sit off the layout somewhere. You'd bring it in, and then you'd maybe set a variable or something. So, but with 16, you can put it into a variable. You don't have that extra field. You don't have to worry about that stuff there. And then the second one is the actual URL that you're going to use to get the data. So you just like this URL that you go to a website and you put in your parameters. You have the URL in the get options in the URL. You use that in your script step, and it will pull the data in there. So let's take a look and see what some of those look like. So you can see some differences here. These are, I don't know if anyone in the back can see that I can't zoom in on the slide, but I've got 4 different web services that we pulled in data from. Google Finances, been around for a while. Weather Underground to pull some weather data. Smarty Streets to pull some address information, and then Bank Watch, which is sort of a legal service to get case information. Right? Just format the Smarty Streets and Bank Watch to make it a little bit more readable, so that we'll see what that looks like. So if I put some returns in there, put some returns in here in the Bank Watch, the Google Finances shows up like this when you pull it down, and so it's pretty easy. But you can see the standards are not identical, right? So in Google Finances, you have a double slash, and then you have a prefix of an array. Some JSON will be arrays to start with, and there's a reason for that, especially if you're using JavaScript to build, say, maps or to build charts. So I think Jeremy Brown has a session later that will talk about web viewers in FileMaker, and it uses JSON, and they start with arrays, they're not objects. So they're just wanting to have arrays, which is the collection of data. But in the Google Finances one, it has a double slash, which really is a little bit different from the other ones as well. The Weather Underground and the Bank Watch both start as objects with the curly brackets, and then Smarty Streets, if you can see, it has another array there, so they're slightly different. So we have to deal with that when we want to parse that into FileMaker, right? So this one has white space with it. Some of them, like the Smarty Streets and the Bank Watch, came with no white space, and you had to make it a little more readable, right? So there are in this case, there's a key, the response key, which is the root key, and it has everything that is below that. So think of this as the primary record that you're on, and anything else could be portals, related records, and so on. So that's our main key. So response is the main record that we have in there. Right? This one has some white space in here just for indenting, so we can read it. Smarty Streets, again, it has the array as the opening, and then Bank Watch has a nested array and objects inside that array. So for parsing this in FileMaker, our Google Finances would come back as malformed because it's not the way that it expects it. Even if we're looking at, say, a web validator or a JSON validator, we might have to consider that this isn't proper JSON, although it does work in the context of the Google Finances API purpose, whereas the Weather Underground would work without any problems. We just have to figure out how to parse the individual pieces. Then we have these other ones as well, so we'd have to look and see how those are. All right. So let's see. So we're going to validate JSON really briefly here. Let's switch this for a second. See if that works. All right. So this here is the Google Finances API. I don't know. I can zoom in here as much, but it has the slash and everything in here. Just take that, copy that, put it into a JSON validator. And there's several validators out there that you can try on the web just to validate one. We're going to look at another one in a second. I'll validate this, and it'll come back and say, this does not work. So we'd have to deal with that in terms of FileMaker. So if we just said that JSON, it's not going to work. All right, so what can we do with invalid JSON? Well, we can clean it up. Right? So we can use a custom function. Any custom function that you're going to use is going to be truly custom to that one. It may not work across the other ones. All right, so we'll see how that is in a second. In parsing JSON, we've got options for parsing. So first option is the plugin, base elements, free plugin, comes with some JSON functions. There's modular FileMaker. There's a JSON module in there that Dan Smith created, and you can check that out. You've got also custom functions with base elements. This is a really good one if you're doing anything pre-16, Todd Geist's custom functions with base elements. And it's very similar to the 16 functions. And then our custom functions that we have. So we've got a parsing custom function to look at. The key is to turn that into, or the goal is to turn that into key and value pairs. Once we have the key and value pairs, we'll find the first location. Then we'll return the result. And that's it. So we'll see that in action here. OK. All right, so here we have the same Google Finance API here that we're using. We can just pull this into JSON, or pull it in. from JSON here. So this has now pulled the JSON down from FileMaker, from the API. As you can see, it's in here. What we need to do is clean that up. There's 3 stages to do that. All right, so step 1 is we're going to take the custom function we have. I'm going to look at that here. All right. So this function just does some substitute stuff. And it substitutes out some of the tags in there so that you get rid of the square brackets, extra commas and stuff. The extra commas can be a problem because some of the text in there might have commas, so we might have to deal with that. But for now, we're just going to substitute all of that stuff out using this one function here. Once we get that clean JSON text, so again, JSON is just text here. Now we see that we've got our key value pairs. The person who wrote this likes abbreviations or is not very clear stuff here. But if you want to find this data, now you have these key value pairs, and it's separated by a colon. So using any sort of substitutes, middle values, and all that stuff, you can then extract this information out from here. And it's fairly easy to do. One thing you can see here is you look at the LT. Right? The LT has July 25, comma, and then our date. So that didn't quite make it in here, but we'll see there's a way around that. But for now, this captures like 90% of what we do. Again, custom functions will be custom. All right, so step 2. Step 2, we're now going to gather the information that we need. So we have the element here of lfix, or the key of lfix, which is down here, and we'll get the data out of it. So using another option, another custom function here. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but so here. So this custom function essentially gets 4 elements out of it. It gets a starting point where the colon is, that's the separator, and then it breaks the values out into a list so that we can see what that looks like. And then once you have that list out there, then you can go in and get the difference out of there. So the result is here. These files are on the FileMaker site, so if you want to spend more time to look at that, you can. We're just going to look at how that's set up. But so now we have our result here. This is what we care about. So once we have the element in here, the lfix, and we can write our script to identify any of these and pull the result into our fields. Right? So if we want to get the comma out, then we have to use another option in here. So this here would clean it with the commas intact. And what we're doing in there is we're saying we're able in this case, because the commas separating them have no space, whereas this comma has a space. So we can say, if there's a comma space, change that into something else, remove all the commas, then put this comma back. So that's another way to custom that part there. Right? So if that, once we have all those pieces there, then we might have some results that have, let's see, this one here. The ID, right? So the ID has a leading space in there, so we're going to trim that out. So the cleanup result here would trim that and give us our final item out of there. Then you have all those pieces. You could do that in one step. So if I just change this here to something else, say lcur, run that, and get that out. So those combinations of custom functions will clean that data out. All right, so that's pre-16. So the more exciting stuff is in 16. I know 16 is young. It's only 2 months old. So if you haven't really used it yet, you can still use the same format in these if you're using the functions that Todd Geist created. Those functions, so anything that you see here almost everything will work in those, right? So yeah, we now have native functions in 16, right? So there's 6 functions in here, and just list all these here. All right, so these are the 6. Most of these, in fact, 4 of these have the exact same 2 parameters. So the word JSON, and then the word key or index or path. So early on I said I like to use the word key because it's short, but it also shows up in this parameter, so it helps me remember that. It also has index for arrays, and then it has the word path. And we'll see why the word path is in there. So when we have nested objects, we have to have a series of breadcrumbs down to the key that we need to get. And that breadcrumb, or series of breadcrumb, is a path. So that's the path that we talk in here. So anytime you're using you're getting JSON, you're going to have to use that path in there, or that key if it's just the primary or the first or the root key, or the index if it's the array. JSON format elements takes just a JSON as the parameter. It's used to clean it up. You can also use it to validate the JSON. So it's got two functions in there if you want to test for it being valid before we actually do anything. And then JSON set element, which has 4 parameters. It has the value and the type as you're creating. So remember, when you're setting them, you need to define the type. And you also need to put the value in there. When you're getting the value out, all you have to do is identify the element. So we're going to look at the get function first. That's because that's the primary stuff that we're going to look at here in terms of the demo. The parameters, so in this case, the first parameter is a field that we have, so JSON raw. It could be a variable, but that's the JSON, the chunk of JSON that we're looking at. And then the second parameter, in this case, is the key. So the key is ID. So if I used JSON raw ID, then I would extract the value out. I don't have to use any custom functions. All I have is this one function with 2 parameters, and it resolves that for me. Right. If I'm tracing this down into a nested object, so in this case, it has an object with another object. So case is the parent object or root object. ID is the next object. We use a dot notation between them, or a period. So case.id is the path. All right. In this case, I've got another object below there. So if I go current observation dot display location dot city, I'm now going 3 levels deep in the path. And so we can see that the path is important in terms of what we have here. We're talking about arrays. Arrays are square brackets. When we look at arrays, it's a square bracket. When we want to get the array out, we have to have a square bracket in there. So I have here data as the root object, dot as the next path down into the medical trials, which is an array. 3 indicates not the third value, but the fourth, because it's 0-based, so 0, 1, 2, 3. And then countries, which is the key inside that array. So again, element iteration for arrays, 0-based. So anytime if you run into that issue with brackets, it's going to be 0-based for arrays. All right, so let's see some of this in 16. All right. So this is a demo file. This demo file I wrote for my articles out there. So, and it's also included in the stuff with some examples, slightly tweaked over here. But this is our JSON right here. So right now it's not very readable. It's all just smooshed together. So we can make it a little pretty, and we can say, OK, let's clean that up. And when you use the format element function, it will reorder your keys alphabetically. So you'll have address as the first here. In this case, we have first name showing up at the top. Here we have address because FileMaker will just rename those. Then you have inside address, you have an array, an object with city, postal code, street address. You have another set of keys with values, and then you have an array for the phone numbers. So phone numbers right here is our key, and that tells us for phone numbers, we have an array. So I like to think, like I said earlier, I like to think of arrays as portals because you can have a portal with phone numbers, and then you have 2 columns, the number and the type inside there. Right. So now, if I'm looking at this and I say I want to get the first name, all I have to do is say JSON get element. This is a field. I don't have to use the fully qualified field name because I'm right in here. But so I test that. It returns John. JSON in here is case sensitive. If I just do first name like this and test that, it won't find it. So if you look at your JSON here anytime, like postal code and so on, that's going to be case sensitive, and you want to make sure that you extract that. All right. All right. So our address here is an object. So it's an object with elements inside there. So city, postal code, and so on are nested inside this object. If I need to get that, I need this dot between the address and the postal code. So if I go address, postal code to extract the 12345, then I just have to use that, and then it puts it in. If I just did postal code like this, it won't find it. So you have that breadcrumb or that path down to it. So remember the parameter here is key or index or path. And in this case, the path is the path that we have to have down from the address to the postal code, right? So if we wanted to look at just the address itself, see what's inside there, it returns the entire object. So if I get this, I'll see that the entire object is in here. And if I want to extract one item out of that, then I have to get to the next one. So address, say, city, and then it will get my city out of that object, right? Yes? When you do the format, JSON format elements, that alphabetizes that makes it pretty. So it really doesn't care where it is in the sequence. In XML, when you're parsing XML, sometimes that you need the order to be exact. So you have to go down. You can't sort of just pull it randomly. With JSON, it's you just extract it based on the path. It doesn't matter. So if it alphabetizes it or not a big deal. The main thing is that it's case sensitive. But where it is in terms of the address, city, and so on, that doesn't matter. It's as long as you can trace the path down there, that's what's important. Sure. Phone numbers is an array here. So we have square brackets. Because we have the square brackets right here, we have to put our square brackets inside our path, which includes the index here. So phone numbers, if I just did phone numbers, it would give me the entire array. I want to extract a value or an element out of that, so I have to identify which index is in there. So in this case, I'm getting the second value. If I said I want to get the second value and I put 2, it won't return anything. If I want to put 1 in there, then it will give me that type there. So keep that in mind. Again, I'm emphasizing that because when I learned arrays years ago, that always threw me up because arrays are zero-based. But when I'm iterating through loops and stuff like that, I always start the counter at 1. So, all right. All right, so this is a little bit more complex JSON here. It's a big chunk of JSON. This is from HubSpot. So HubSpot has an API, and you can get a ton of data out of there. And it's difficult to read because there's so much in here. So even if you format this, you're looking at this and saying, well, I have to make this bigger, so it doesn't really work here. So what we can do is we can use another online tool here, a JSON editor. So let's collapse all of this stuff. All right, so this JSON editor, this is one of many. This JSON editor on JSONeditorOnline.org. I like this because it'll help you trace the path down to the element that you need, right? So once you paste this in here and you push it over and you see how it's formatted, you see that there's a root object. It names those in here in terms of objects, and then you can see anytime there's a square bracket, there's an array. If there's a curly bracket in here, it's an object. The data I need is inside the properties object, so I just expand that here, and I see that there's 56 values inside this object, and I want to look at, say, this annual revenue here. I have 2 objects in here. I have an array with versions. I have a value inside there, and it traces down the path of where you need to go, right? So to get to this timestamp value here, you have to go all the way from properties down into the annual revenue, into the versions, into that array, just to get this timestamp value. So this is a good tool if you have some complex JSON that you want to look at. But also if you want just any JSON, you put it into this, and you can see, do I have objects, do I have arrays, how are they nested, and so on, right? So if I go in here, the key or index or path that I want is this parameter. I cheated and I put it in here. So this has properties, HS email bounce version, 0 for the array indicator for that first value. Even if there's only one value in the array, you need to put that index in there, and then the timestamp. And then I can test that, and I have this result. This validate button here will open the editor that I just showed you. So if you get this file, you can just click this validate. It'll go to that link, and you can use that. Okay. All right. So here is another JSON with some nested objects and arrays. If I just wanted to get, say, data inside this elements here, and I thought, well, you put rows.elements and then the array index, test that, it's going to give me an error because that's not valid. What I have to do is actually get more stuff in here. So I have to put the distance.text in here. So it's buried inside here. This is a Google API object. So if I now test that, then I can get my 6.5 miles, my distance between two points there. So if you wonder why do I need this, why do I need JSON? Well, so many web services out there will offer up options, and once you get to those web services, then you want to get that data out. So if I want to just get 6.5 miles distance between these two addresses, this is all the stuff that I have to wade through just to get where I am here. Okay. And then here, this is I threw this in here because it's in the certification guide. So if you download the FileMaker 16 certification guide, there's some JSON in here, and you can look and see how that would work if you wanted to test and see what do I have in the person. So in the person, it'll show me the objects inside this array here, and then I can play around with how that works. Yes. Well, by consistent, you mean something like I showed early on with that finance API?
No. The JSON's formatted correctly. It's just that sometimes elements are there and sometimes they're not. Like if they don't have the data, they just don't return you a blank element.
Exactly.
Nothing, but you're expecting to at least find the element.
Well, it's not always there because it's not. Some JSON, if you do a query for two different records by IID, one might have that data, one might not. So if it doesn't have it, you just say, OK, there's nothing in there. Right? So you check for it, but if it returns empty and you know it's valid because you've tested it beforehand, you just know there's no data in that object. So just like in a record in FileMaker, you may not have every field filled out. The same thing in JSON, because JSON, the web service will have captured data and they want to return it. But if it's not in there, it doesn't mean that it's invalid. It means that it's not there. If you've tested it beforehand, and usually what you have to do is you test each piece, make sure it works, and then you say, OK, we're good. Now you let it run. But if it's not there, it's just not there. It's just like in a record. The field is empty, it's empty. Okay. So we've looked at parsing in FileMaker 16 real briefly here in terms of the string, getting that, the object, the array. Beyond the parsing part, what do we have? Well, we can create JSON in FileMaker. We can use JSON to send parameters inside FileMaker or send it outside. So there's a good article out there by one of the seed code guys on how to create parameters and send that in JSON. And other people have probably done the same thing, but I know this one came out like right after it, and I was writing one around the same time. So in terms of creating JSON, if you're using 16 and using the curl function, so you can build JSON to send to a web service. Say simple consign is one that needs parameters in JSON, and you can send that out, building it from FileMaker. Right. So we're going to quickly jump into that last demo there. All right. Okay. So when we're creating or using JSON set element, we've got 4 parameters. The JSON that we're setting it, which if the JSON doesn't exist, we have to declare it. If the JSON exists, we use that variable usually in the script. We're identifying where we're putting that key or index or path that we're creating, so we can do just a simple key value pair or an object. And then the value, what's inside that we're actually setting, and then the type. So those are 4 things. So in this case here, I've got 4 parameters. So I'm setting a blank JSON because I haven't declared it. I'm using this field here as my key. I'm using the value John as my value. And I'm using the data type string. Right? So the result becomes name first John. So if I delete this so we can test that, and I click create, so that creates this. If I now go here and I say change that to Jane, click create, and that updates this name first. So the name first here, so this simple JSON object has just name first as my key, and it has Jane as the value. So then the more fun stuff is if we look at a record, and I'm zooming in here just so we can all see it at the back here. But so in this case here, we've got a FileMaker record that has some data. It has a portal with phone numbers. So again, that goes back to my analogy with arrays as portals, but they can be much, much more than that. Portals aren't really multidimensional, but arrays can become multidimensional. So here, if we want to do set the JSON name, we'll set that from here, first name SE. So if I want to do more than that, I can do multiple things, right? So now I have multiple values set in one step. And let's take a look at how that works. So here, I'm now doing it as a script, because instead of just pulling it out, getting it from a field and pulling it in, I now have to do multiple things. And so I'm setting a variable here. If you can't see it, I'll zoom in a little bit. Setting a variable to the value with JSON set element to just a blank object here. And then we'll look at that here. And for each of the key value pairs, I can, inside the square bracket, so this is the only time the square bracket really isn't an array. It's more like in the substitute function where you can nest the different, or not just nest them, but you can have a sequence of key value pairs that you want to add. The number 1 here is just a leftover. The number 1 through 6 is the data type, but you can also use strings like JSON string, JSON number, JSON boolean, JSON array, and so on. So just have a number here just to keep it simple and not have too much in here in terms of what's happening. But so this first name is being set to the context first name is being set to the first name, last name, and so on down to the email. So you can easily create JSON that has multiple values like this in one go, right? So when you're getting into something like the address, that's a little bit more complicated because you're setting an object in here. So what we have to do in this case is first thing here is I set my element, my initial JSON with the same thing that I did before. So that's all that JSON address exists in here. So this is the object that I'm creating, and then now I'm in the second part setting the address into a new JSON, so that I'm working from the inside out. And there may be better ways to do this, but in this way I can see what's happening because I'm building the inside value, and then I'm attaching that to a key. And the data type is JSON object. So this is just a custom function, but you can also just do JSON object like that, and it'll work because that's the native way that handles the number parameters, or data type parameters in there. All right. And then last thing I do here is I just set this to JSON format elements so it's readable. So now it doesn't need that, but it makes it more readable so I can see what's happening inside that function there. All right. JSON phone here is an array. So if I take the array in here, I go and first thing that I do here is a little bit different. I say I'm going to declare an array. Zoom in here. So it's square brackets. So that's my array, again, working inside out. Then I'll go to my portal and loop through that portal and build my, starting with a 0 counter, build my array in here. Once I have the array built, then I just set that array to this field. And then you can just do one little step, and that does everything. That combines all this stuff into an object. So once you have this as a JSON object for that record, you can now send that JSON out to a web service, or you can send it inside FileMaker, and you can do kind of neat things with that. So that's essentially it. I'm trying to save a few minutes here for questions. So there will be a few minor updates to these slides and to the demos. So these will be posted fairly soon. And then last of all, thank you very much for coming this morning. So if there are any questions, yes? Reserved characters such as square brackets. Okay, so you have square brackets or commas maybe, or if you have double quotes inside there, you would have to escape those. So if you have any characters inside the field that you're building the JSON or parsing now, you need to escape those characters. You don't have to escape everything, but special characters like that you will need to escape using a slash. Yeah. A number of elements in an array, you can loop through the array. You can get JSON list keys, and that will give you the number of elements in the array. So if you list the keys, and it'll tell you have 5 in there, that's your 5. And it's going to be 0 through 4 for the index, but it's JSON list keys. Yes?
Is there a big speed difference between the function version of JSON
Between the function version and pre-16?
and
Not really. I mean, it's more simplicity, right? Because if the custom function may not always work, you may have to tweak certain things to work it, but the built-in function is going to parse any valid JSON. Nope. I've used both, and I've not noticed any major difference. Yeah. Any other questions? Right, I mean, there is some sort of JSON path function, but there's not anything like that related in FileMaker. So just like you have XML path, you have JSON path. So is there a facility to run a query in JSON and get stuff out, like it's almost like SQL query? Is that what you talk about? Like a Oh yeah, no, there's not natively in FileMaker, so no. I mean, there is potentially a JSON path, like there is an X path, but that's not in this here. Yeah.